The universe is vast, dark, and indifferent, yet some forces burn brighter than the void itself. Imagine a figure clad in infernal armor that devours light, stepping through the shattered hull of a starship, the scent of promethium and ozone curling in the void around him. Rumors whisper of worlds where even the most disciplined regiments of the Astra Militarum falter before him, where orc warbands scatter like leaves before a gale. Some claim he moves with preternatural intent, a whirlwind of rage and unyielding purpose, as if the very fabric of reality quivers beneath his assault. Yet this is more than legend. It is a question of cosmic scale. What would happen if the Doomslayer, an entity forged in ceaseless war and annihilation, were cast into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where angels of death, gods of war, and machine cults contend for survival? Before we descend into the fire and ruin of this tale, if the pulse of galactic warfare, mythic combat, and whispered rumor calls to you, like, share, and subscribe. Let your allegiance be known to those who walk the endless battlefield. The stars beyond the viewport were indifferent, cold pinpricks against an eternal black that had swallowed entire systems before any whispered record could survive. Inside the drifting Imperial cruiser, the air was thick with the acrid tang of burned circuitry and scorched promethium, a scent that clung to every bulkhead like a warning. Sparks arced along shattered conduits, sizzling in the recycled air, while servitors with sparking augmetic arms flailed uselessly against gravity's hesitant pull. The vessel's alarms were a discordant choir, their wailing muted by distance and the chaotic harmonics of the hull's slow collapse. Somewhere down the port corridor, a corporal's panicked voice echoed, swallowed mid-word as a plate of reinforced adamantium twisted and fell. I moved through the shadows, though to call it movement seemed almost beneath the reality of what I was. Each step was a tremor, a pulse that carried more weight than the vessel's mass. The Doomslayer had arrived, though no one aboard yet understood the scale of what had breached their sanctum. His armor, dark and dented with the memory of 100 campaigns, seemed to drink in the dim emergency lighting, leaving only silhouettes in its wake. He carried no hesitation. Hesitation was a currency this universe could not afford. Orcs shrieked from behind ruptured bulkheads, their green faces twisted in gleeful cruelty. But they were nothing but windmills for a force of pure intent. Each strike, each motion, was a sentence in a story of annihilation written in real time across the corridors of the damned. The crew huddled in corners, their breaths shallow, lungs filled with smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. Imperial training offered them discipline, but terror is a teacher far older than any regiment, and even the hardened soldiers of the Astra Militarum faltered when confronted with an entity whose presence seemed to bend the very sound of the air around him. Somewhere a data slate clattered to the floor, its screen fractured, yet its vox grill continued to emit fragmented cries for command, swallowed by the cacophony of destruction. The Doomslayer advanced past each obstacle, each muttering servitor, each quivering guard, leaving a trail of silence punctuated by the sudden absence of life. Time warped in those corridors. Seconds stretched into eternities. The clang of bolter fire ricocheting off hull plating echoed, but bullets seldom found purchase. The orcs, once brash and confident, now flailed in disarray, their manic laughter broken into pained screams. Even the mechanical logic of the Skitarii seemed to falter in his presence, as if instinct, that crude and unreliable force, outstripped cogitator calculations. Hull panels dented and splintered under blows that should have shattered even reinforced adamantium, yet the Doomslayer pressed forward, relentless. A tide of wrath incarnate, and in that relentless advance something else unfolded. The ship's ancient systems, old enough to remember the glory of the Emperor's edicts and yet degraded by centuries of service, hummed in uneasy synchrony, as if aware that an external force was rewriting the equation of survival. Flickers of lights, conduits sparking along the walls, servos hesitating in their rotation, all responded to the cadence of his advance. The Doomslayer did not pause. He did not hesitate. Orc glyphs and Mechanicus runes alike were mere background noise against the rhythm of his passage. The crew, human and cyborg alike, whispered prayer under their breath, some calling upon saints long dead, others muttering litany to the throne, desperate for intervention that might never come. As he reached the heart of the vessel, the central passage where life support systems hummed in precarious equilibrium, the Doomslayer paused, not out of deliberation but recognition. He surveyed the architecture, noting the choke points, the traps, the points where desperation would manifest most fully. Then with the suddenness of a falling star he advanced again, and the ship itself seemed to tremble in response, its steel bones shivering beneath the inexorable weight of his presence. Every sound was magnified, the hiss of leaking promethium, the metallic thrum of failing servos, the low groan of the hull under stress. It all became a symphony of tension and impending ruin, a backdrop to a force that would not stop until its calculus was complete. In that moment, one could imagine the stars beyond observing silently, unfeeling witnesses to a singular event that would ripple through time and space. Whether in the prayers of crewmen, in the fractured perception of Skitarii augmetics, or in the unconscious awareness of orc beasts, the presence of the Doomslayer had already rewritten the rules of engagement. Survival was no longer a guarantee. It had become an illusion, fragile and brittle, a candle flickering in the howling vacuum of the void. And yet, for all the carnage, the terror, and the inexorable logic of annihilation, there was a strange rhythm to it, a cadence that suggested this was only the beginning, that the real reckoning waited beyond the ship's failing hull, where whispers of stars and the distant gaze of Terra might witness a force unmatched, unstoppable, and utterly resolute. The corridors of the cruiser reeked of ozone and scorched metal, but in that suffocating haze of heat and smoke, weapons roared their defiance. Bolt guns spat iron across twisting passageways, and the discharge of plasma cast ephemeral shadows against dented bulkheads. Every crackle of fire, every hiss of superheated gas was a heartbeat in the ship's death throes. The Doomslayer advanced amid it all, a predator navigating a forest of flame and steel. He did not merely use weapons. He became a vector through them, transforming each explosion, each ricochet into a rhythm he alone could hear. The orcs and Skitarii alike were instruments in a symphony of destruction, and the Doomslayer, both conductor and tempest, shaped it with hands and boots that carried no hesitation. He encountered the first line of defense, Skitarii Vanguard, their augmentic limbs calibrated for efficiency, their brains a mesh of cogitators and neural implants. They opened fire with disciplined precision, plasma arcs slicing the smoky air, bullets ricocheting off reinforced plates. Yet each projectile seemed to find its inevitability in his armor, absorbed, deflected, or shattered. The Doomslayer moved like a force of kinetic inevitability, boot-smashing servos, gauntlets tearing through carapace, his every motion precise yet violent, as though physics itself had become a suggestion rather than a law. Sparks flew with every strike, hissing along conduits like a miniature storm, while the smell of ozone and singed flesh thickened to a tangible weight. Orcs poured through ruptured bulkheads, a tide of green rage and jagged steel. They were brash, careless, but their sheer volume carried terror. Each orc that lunged found the Doomslayer's response instantaneous and unforgiving. He twisted, parried, and struck with mechanical grace, cleaving limbs and armor alike. Blood, oil, and promethium sprayed in a fine mist, coating walls and floors, creating a slippery, lethal canvas upon which he painted devastation. Yet even in the frenzy there was method, a ritualistic cadence. His presence imposed order upon chaos, and the ship itself seemed to react, creaking and shuddering under the weight of violence that bent its metallic bones. In the armory, he paused only briefly to acknowledge the instruments around him. Bolters, meltaguns, arc rifles, and the rare, carefully preserved relics of forgotten campaigns. Each could have been a weapon in the wrong hands, but in his they became mere extensions of intent. He wielded them with a discipline that bordered on reverence, though reverence for nothing but the calculus of survival and the imperative of destruction. Here, the Doomslayer's interaction with war became almost poetic. A charged plasma gun discharged with a searing scream, melting an orc's armored chest. A fallen Skitarii's mechanical limbs were ripped apart in mid-arc, their systems sparking in a futile resistance. Every act of violence was precise, deliberate, as if the laws of causality themselves had bent to observe his rhythm. The crew watched from the shadows, hearts pounding and lungs filled with choking smoke, perceiving him in fragments, a blur of dark armor, the hiss of energy, the snap of bones and metal. Some prayed to the Emperor, others whispered forgotten rites, and a few simply stared, paralyzed, understanding in some dim, primal sense that this was no human, no Xenos, no machine. They were witnessing an elemental force, a measureless judgment enacted upon all in his path. Bolts tore through walls, sparks rained from shattered conduits, and somewhere in the distance the skeletal wail of a damaged vox grill pleaded for mercy that would never come. And yet, even amidst the orchestration of carnage, there was clarity. Every enemy, every obstacle, every weapon was a note in a melody the Doomslayer alone could interpret. His senses were attuned to the resonance of battle, the hiss of energy, the groan of stressed metal, the sharp tang of blood in the recycled air. The ship, wounded and screaming, became his stage, and the Doomslayer performed an aria of annihilation, each crescendo punctuated by the shattering of armor and bone. Those who survived to tell the tale would later speak of him not as a warrior, but as inevitability incarnate, a judgment that moved faster than thought and struck deeper than fear. By the time he reached the central junction of the cruiser, the corridors were unrecognizable. Smoke hung in thick clouds. Molten metal streamed from ruptured conduits, and the air was charged with energy and fear. Orcs lay in twisted heaps. Skitarii were reduced to sparking husks, and the few remaining humans clung to shadows, eyes wide with awe and terror. The Doomslayer paused briefly, only to survey the scene with measured detachment, as if to mark the completion of one movement before the next began. Beyond this, the path forward promised even greater opposition, and already the whispers of those who would survive to speak of him began to spread. A dark legend among the stars, a reckoning that moved with the inexorability of the void itself. The ship's corridors were no longer merely metallic passageways. They had become crucibles, each step a trial of endurance, each breath a defiance against the encroaching ruin. The Doomslayer moved as if he had always been here, though the vessel bore no memory of him, no expectation that such a force could manifest. Sparks and smoke clung to the air like a living fog, obscuring shapes and creating fleeting phantoms that his eyes ignored. Orcs pressed from every angle, their jagged teeth glinting in the emergency lights, yet they collided with him as waves crash against cliffs, impotent and fragmented. Skitarii units attempted coordination, yet even their augmented reflexes faltered in the presence of something that seemed to anticipate each motion before it occurred. Every corridor became a stage for intimate horror. Bolts tore through bulkheads, plasma arcs scorched walls, and the smell of ozone mingled with the copper tang of blood. Yet amidst the chaos, the Doomslayer's movements were precise, almost contemplative. A gauntleted hand grasped a falling orc, hurling it into a console that burst into flame. A pulse from a discharging bolter was met with a deft sidestep, a counter-strike that rendered a Skitarii soldier into twisted scrap. Each action was brutal, intimate, and deliberate. It left witnesses, human and Xenos alike, with a memory burned into their senses that would not fade. The ship's own timbers groaned as if it, too, recognized the scale of the force moving within it, the subtle rhythm of destruction that respected no law but its own. The crew, clinging to shadows, could see fragments, the glint of his visor reflecting molten sparks, the hiss of servos in his armor, the subtle tremor in the hull as his boots landed. Whispers began to form, words muttered under breaths tight with fear and awe. Some spoke to the Emperor, invoking prayers that seemed to vanish before reaching the ceiling. Others swore to the machine spirits, hoping that the Omnissiah might see mercy where humans could not. No ritual offered protection here. Survival depended on proximity, timing, and luck, and the Doomslayer cared little for either. He was not a hunter, he was an event. Every moment in his wake felt accelerated, stretched beyond human comprehension, yet perfectly coherent within the framework of his singular purpose. As the ship's hull began to fracture, fissures of light seared through metal, illuminating pools of debris and the corpses of those who had dared oppose him. Here, amid the chaos, the nature of the Doomslayer's presence became undeniable. He was more than a warrior. He was a reckoning. Orcs howled in confusion as their formations collapsed. Skitarii, whose minds were engineered to calculate and anticipate, failed to account for instinct rendered absolute, reflex made perfect by a force beyond reason. Even the mechanical logic of the ship's systems faltered, circuits overloading, lights flickering, and gravity pumps oscillating violently, as if the vessel itself recognized that this intruder defied the natural order. Every strike left a mark, not merely on flesh or metal, but on perception. Witnesses described the sound as a distortion, a resonance that set teeth on edge and hearts hammering. Sparks hissed, armor plates dented, and promethium pools ignited with startling suddenness. Within the cacophony, the Doomslayer moved with a terrifying calm, each breath measured, each step purposeful. each motion a punctuation in a sentence written only in violence and consequence. The ship had become a crucible, testing every limit of flesh, metal, and nerve. Those who survived would carry this memory as a scar upon their minds, a psychic imprint of inevitability. At the corridor's end, where gravity fluctuated and the hull threatened to collapse entirely, he paused briefly, surveying the carnage with a detached precision. Here the crucible had reached its peak. Orcs shattered, Skitarii incapacitated, human crew on the edge of delirium. And yet beyond this point, the corridors opened toward the central spine of the ship, toward systems that governed life, navigation, and the fragile balance keeping this vessel aloft in the void. The Doomslayer's path was clear, and in that clarity the survivors glimpsed the truth. What had passed through their midst was no mere warrior. It was a judgment. It was inevitability, and the next chamber promised stakes far beyond survival, where flesh alone would no longer suffice to resist the coming storm. The corridors opened into a vast atrium, a cathedral of steel and shadow where the hum of life support systems merged with the solemn vibrations of distant machinery. Servitors knelt among fractured consoles, their augmetic limbs trembling as they whispered prayers in binary and litany alike. Fox grills flickered and cracked with fragmented calls, voices rising and breaking, each word an echo of hope teetering on despair. The Doomslayer advanced with the inexorability of a celestial tide, indifferent to whispered devotion or mechanical hymn. Yet even in the heart of chaos, the rituals of the Imperium pressed upon him, insistent in their fragile authority. Some crewmen whispered of visions. In the flickering glow of damaged lights, they claimed to see fragments of the Emperor's countenance in the armor of their intruder, glimpses of a power that judged without mercy. Others swore that the Astronomicon itself faltered, its psychic light dimming briefly as if recoiling from the presence of a force unbound by human comprehension. These were rumors, liturgical speculations, the musings of minds teetering on the edge of fear and awe. Yet the effect was undeniable. A quiet, almost sacred hush settled over the survivors, a recognition that they bore witness to something that transcended the ordinary. Mechanicus Augmetic scanned the Doomslayer, their lenses flickering, attempting to categorize, to rationalize, to encode the anomaly into known parameters. The results were inconsistent, fragmented, and ultimately meaningless. No cogitator, no machine spirit could account for the absolute precision, the kinetic inevitability, the singularity of purpose that moved through their systems. Even the most disciplined Skitarii hesitated, their neural implants failing to reconcile instinct with the raw, incomprehensible efficiency before them. He moved past them, silent but imposing, each step a note in the unspoken symphony of fear and reverence. Fragments of crew dared to speak, their voices trembling as they described what they perceived. "It is not a man," whispered one ensign, eyes wide. "It is judgment itself." Another, kneeling before a failing data slate, muttered prayers in voices too quiet to carry. The Doomslayer neither heard nor cared, yet the weight of their attention seemed to press against the armor he wore, as if the combined awe and fear of the Imperium itself were a tangible force. Here, amidst shattered statues of saints and scorched banners of the Imperial Aquila, the line between faith and observation blurred. Rumors became half-truths. Half-truths became legend. The atrium itself seemed to recognize the significance of the moment. Light faltered along its height, shadows pooling in angles unnatural to the architecture. Sparks from severed conduits danced like spectral fireflies across walls etched with battle honors older than memory. The Doomslayer paused briefly, not out of contemplation but of recognition. The space itself, a consecrated environment of human devotion, bore witness to the anomaly moving through it. Servitors knelt, weapons frozen in half-gesture, their systems awaiting orders that would never come. In those moments, the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. Rumors spread through the surviving Vox networks, fragmented and distorted, claiming glimpses of the Emperor's will observing from the Golden Throne, perceiving a force that moved without allegiance but enacted the most absolute form of judgment. Whether true or merely the desperate imagining of minds at the edge of despair, the effect was tangible. Even the Doomslayer, an entity of raw kinetic intent, became a measure against which faith and fear alike were tested. The whispers of the Emperor were not direct, not declarative. They were suggestion, perception, uncertainty, but they suffused the atrium with gravity and awe. marking the passage of a presence that would echo far beyond the vessel itself. By the time he moved toward the inner sanctum, the corridors behind him were silent save for the hiss of burning conduits and the faint groan of metal under stress. Survivors glanced at one another with wide, terrified eyes, understanding that what they had witnessed defied comprehension. In this crucible of faith and fear, the Doomslayer became more than flesh and armor. He became a symbol, a question, a rumor transformed into presence. And as the path ahead opened toward the manufactorums and sacred chambers of the Mechanicus, the universe itself seemed to whisper in anticipation, hinting at conflicts not merely of flesh but of will, belief, and the unyielding calculus of cosmic consequence. The manufactorum loomed like a cathedral of metal and ritual, its towering conduits humming with power, redolent of oil and ozone. The air was thick with the scent of sacred oil, scorched by welding torches and punctuated by the faint tang of molten steel. Cogitator arrays blinked with the frantic precision of the Mechanicus's tireless calculations, yet even their cold logic faltered at the Doomslayer's presence. Servo arms hung mid-motion, augmetic sensors whirring futilely as if the machines themselves sensed the anomaly moving among them. This was a realm where ritual dictated function, where precision was law, and yet here was a force that ignored both, reshaping the environment with the rhythm of unstoppable purpose. Castellan robots and Skitarii advanced in disciplined formations, their plasma beams cutting arcs of incandescent energy across the shadows. But where calculation met instinct, the latter held dominion. The Doomslayer moved as though the manufactorum itself were an extension of his will, boots landing with crushing authority, gauntlets tearing through servo limbs, the hiss of superheated metal joining the symphony of destruction. Sparks rained from damaged conduits mingling with the acrid odor of scorched oil, and the augmented warriors fell like rag dolls, their circuitry frying under the sheer kinetic inevitability of each strike. He did not pause. He did not hesitate. Each movement was measured against purpose alone, a testament to the supremacy of instinct over computation. Servitors attempted intervention, their etched-lit sigils flickering with the energy of desperate devotion, their mechanical limbs struggling to meet the demands of a battle that exceeded their programming. A data slate clattered from a console, its screen shattered. Yet the ancient liturgies encoded within continued to loop, a futile mantra against the living tempest that advanced. Even the hierophants and magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus, adorned in robes soiled with oil and devotion, could only watch in fragmented awe, their prayers caught between faith and disbelief. It was not merely combat, it was judgment enacted on a scale that transcended the manufactorum itself. The Doomslayer's interaction with technology was both violent and precise, as though he understood the architecture of the machines in a way that no flesh-bound mind could. Servo arms were torn from their housings and hurled across molten floors, plasma coils overloaded with sudden kinetic pressure, arcs of energy illuminating his passage like lightning across a storm-darkened sky. Even the most disciplined Skitarii hesitated, neural implants failing to reconcile anticipation with reality. Here, instinct had become doctrine, motion had become law, and the manufactorum itself seemed to bend to the rhythm of his presence. Rumors began to form among the survivors, whispered between crackling vox grills and sparking consoles. Some claimed he moved with the Emperor's intent, a living fragment of judgment, though others, those attuned to the machine cult's dogma, felt a sacrilege in every shattered cog and severed limb. The manufactorum, a place of sacred function and ritualized violence, had become a theater of chaos where neither faith nor reason could impose control. Yet even as systems failed and machines fell, the Doomslayer did not alter his pace. The rhythm of inevitability continued, unbroken, inexorable, and terrifying in its precision. In the atrium at the manufactorum's core, where plasma conduits converged like the veins of a living entity, the Doomslayer paused just long enough to survey the devastation. Sparks leapt from ruptured lines, molten oil hissed and evaporated into vaporous clouds, and the air vibrated with the resonance of destroyed machinery. Survivors, human and augmented alike, knelt in awe, fear, and disbelief. Here he was no mere combatant. He was the embodiment of pure consequence, a presence that bent not only flesh but machine, not merely life, but expectation itself. And as the path ahead led toward wider conflict and greater revelations, it became clear that the Mechanicus reckoning was not merely physical, It was spiritual, philosophical, and absolute. Beyond the manufactorum, the ship's internal architecture gave way to open decks and sprawling chambers where alliances, fragile and forced, began to fray. Imperial crews huddled in corners, their eyes wide, their minds strained by the relentless presence of the Doomslayer, while orc warbands, previously chaotic but organized by sheer numbers, hesitated in fractured formations. Skitari, once precise instruments of the Mechanicus, now splintered under the pressure of an opponent who defied conventional calculation. The battlefield had shifted. It was no longer simply a struggle of survival, but a crucible testing trust, loyalty, and instinct under duress. The Doomslayer was the catalyst, his relentless advance breaking not only bodies, but the fragile cohesion of combatants aligned by circumstance rather than conviction. The corridors echoed with the clash of weapons and the hiss of energy, yet it was the silence between the impacts that spoke most profoundly. Officers shouted orders, only to find their subordinates frozen or fleeing. Orcs bellowed commands that fell upon deafened ears. Even the augmented warriors of the Mechanicus experienced hesitation, their logic circuits unable to reconcile the immediacy of instinct-driven lethality with the predictable patterns they were trained to enforce. Within this chaos, the Doomslayer moved with unerring certainty, each strike decisive, each motion a statement that allegiance, whether mortal, mechanical, or alien, mattered little against inevitability. Rumors, whispered amid the gunfire and hiss of melting metal, began to weave themselves into the minds of survivors. Some spoke of fragments of the Emperor's will, observing, judging, yet not intervening. Others speculated that the Doomslayer operated outside both loyalty and morality, a force unconstrained by doctrine, serving an inscrutable logic of destruction that even gods might hesitate to confront. These rumors, circulating like contagion, had tangible consequences. Soldiers paused mid-order, orcs reeled in disbelief, and the Mechanicus recalibrated not just strategy but belief, uncertain if the entity before them was instrument, threat, or transcendence. The Doomslayer's path carved through the vessel's defenses with brutal clarity. Every skirmish left the corridors strewn with the remnants of failed allegiances, severed limbs, shattered armor, burned circuitry, and the faint metallic tang of fear. The impact was as psychological as it was physical. Imperial crews, once confident in the hierarchy and discipline of their ranks, found themselves questioning orders, questioning reality, questioning whether survival alone justified continued obedience. Orcs, usually reckless and unrelenting, began to fragment into splintered mobs, their cohesion eroded by witnessing something that ignored strength, size, and brutality. Even Skitari commanders hesitated, recalculating trajectories and formations that had already become irrelevant. Yet through the fractured alliances, there was method to the Doomslayer's approach. He did not simply destroy. He exposed weakness, exploited contradictions, and forced the collapse of collective resolve. He was less a warrior than a force of inevitability, an agent that measured chaos and delivered uncompromising consequence. Each movement reshaped the battlefield, rewriting the calculus of engagement with an unspoken dictum. There is no allegiance beyond survival, and survival is insufficient in the face of certain judgment. By the time he reached the central command atrium, the deck was a tableau of fragmentation. Allies separated, enemies confused, and all witnesses marked by the realization that this was no mere raid. This was an event that would ripple far beyond the vessel itself, altering perceptions, reshaping belief, and leaving a mark upon every mind that dared observe. And yet, even in the wake of shattered alliances, the Doomslayer pressed forward, indifferent to politics, creed, or loyalty. The path led deeper into the ship, toward chambers where the stakes extended beyond the physical and into the metaphysical, places where whispers of the Emperor's perception and the sacred logic of the Mechanicus intertwined, forming a stage for conflict that could challenge even legend. As he advanced, the survivors understood with growing horror that nothing could prepare them for what lay beyond. A reckoning that would test faith, logic, and instinct in ways no mortal or immortal had ever endured. The ship gave way to open decks and orbital platforms, the scale of conflict expanding with terrifying immediacy. Here, the Doomslayer was no longer merely a corridor-bound tempest. He became a force against entire formations, a singularity of destruction moving across the skeletal framework of a war-torn citadel. Hive-worlders and Imperial guardsmen scrambled among shattered barricades, their disciplined volleys scattered by the sheer kinetic inevitability of his advance. Orc mobs surged from breaches, their brutish instinct meeting an executioner whose presence bent the rhythm of battle itself. Each step of the Doomslayer shook the deck beneath him, each strike resonating like a hammer upon the cosmos, and even the steel bones of the station shuddered at his passage. Artillery hummed in anticipation, chains of promethium and plasma fire converging on his projected path, yet his armor absorbed and deflected with unnatural efficacy. Bolter rounds splintered in midair. Orc choppas shattered against reinforced gauntlets. From observation decks, commanders whispered in disbelief as whole regiments faltered. Incapable of adapting to the sudden annihilation that seemed preordained, the Doomslayer's method was neither hasty nor reckless. It was deliberate, a choreography of force honed in ceaseless conflict, where every motion carried consequences far beyond what the participants could comprehend. In his wake, blood, oil, and molten metal mingled in a grotesque tapestry of ruin, yet the cadence of his advance remained singular, unbroken, absolute. The platform's upper levels opened onto a view of the hive city below, a sprawling tangle of towers and manufactorums, where even distant artillery fire felt impotent against his presence. Rumors reached the remaining crew through disrupted vox channels, whispers of Imperial saints observing silently, fragments of Adeptus Custodes scanning from orbital perches, Maggie of the Mechanicus marking each strike as an aberration against calculated law. Whether divine judgment, cosmic coincidence, or perception strained by fear, the effect was the same. Every observer, human, orc, or augmented, felt the Doomslayer's passage as both threat and revelation. His movements became legend even before the last enemy fell, a living myth in real time, a force whose story would outlive those who dared to witness it. Every engagement here escalated in scale. Skitari formations designed to enforce order collapsed under his unrelenting assault. Orcs, enormous in numbers, flailed helplessly, their instinctual tactics rendered meaningless by the incomprehensible precision of his movements. Imperial soldiers trained for discipline and strategy fell into desperation, realizing that conventional coordination offered no advantage against an adversary who defied both logic and expectation. Here, amidst the twisting wreckage of hull plating and shattered barricades, the Doomslayer became not a participant in battle, but a fulcrum around which the very concept of war pivoted. The Citadel's sanctums, where the machinery of governance and defense intersected, became a tableau for the most intimate forms of terror and awe. Servitors paused mid-task, their instruments of war frozen as if recognizing futility. Officers shouted orders into corridors now filled with echoes of fractured allegiance and failed strategy. Even orc nobility, once brazen and domineering, recoiled in uncertainty, sensing a force that acknowledged neither rank nor ritual. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to grant him dominion over reality's rules, leaving all others subject to consequence without appeal. In the central atrium of the Citadel, where battle should have reached equilibrium, the Doomslayer stood as a singular axis of inevitability. Smoke rose in curling pillars around him, molten metal hissed in the shadowed corners, and the air vibrated with energy born of both destruction and anticipation. Every surviving witness understood the immutable truth. He was no longer a warrior among many. He was the storm, the judgment, the measure against which all else would be weighed. Beyond this point lay the next chapter, one not of physical confrontation alone, but of perception, myth, and whispered rumor, where the consequences of his passage would stretch beyond the tangible, challenging belief, faith, and cosmic order itself. As the Citadel's upper decks fell into ruin beneath his relentless advance, whispers began to circulate among those few who survived and watched, murmurs of divinity, judgment, and apotheosis. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of visions glimpsed through smoke and flickering lights, claiming that in the Doomslayer's armor, some fragment of the Emperor's wrath, or perhaps his unseen gaze, manifested. Others, less devoted but equally terrified, theorized that he moved beyond flesh and machine, a force untethered from the laws of the material universe. These were rumors, unconfirmed and speculative, yet they carried weight, shaping perception, inspiring awe, and instilling terror in equal measure. The stories, fragmented and contradictory, became a tapestry of myth forming around a single, undeniable fact. The Doomslayer could not be stopped by conventional force. In the bowels of the manufactorums and across shattered command decks, Mechanicus Augmetics and Skitarii commanders paused in ritualized observation, recalibrating circuits and neural directives in a vain attempt to rationalize what defied calculation. He moved through their sacred spaces as though reality itself had folded to accommodate him. Servo arms froze mid-gesture. Plasma coils overloaded under the sudden kinetic presence of a being whose purpose was absolute. The litany of every machine spirit, the prayers of every servitor, all became background noise against a force whose rhythm was measured only by its own relentless intent. Even the most disciplined observers sensed the subtle distortion. Corridors warped, shadows shifted unnaturally, and for fleeting moments, the very hum of the citadel seemed to hesitate. Rumors of apotheosis took shape in different forms. Imperial guards whispered that fragments of the Emperor's will trembled before such singular force. Magi of the Mechanicus suggested that some unknown calculus of the Omnissiah might be being tested, or perhaps rewritten, by his unrelenting passage. Orc shamans caught in the crossfire spoke of spirits fleeing the material plane, perceiving in instinct a predator whose fury transcended both gods and mortals alike. These whispers were unreliable, contradictory, often rooted in fear or the inadequacy of perception. But they created a psychological battlefield as potent as any physical engagement. The Doomslayer's presence had transformed mere rumor into a tangible instrument of influence, shaping decisions, morale, and belief without uttering a single word. Amid the shattered command decks, human survivors dared to record what they could. Some claimed to see his visor glow briefly with a light that was not reflection but radiance, a phenomenon interpreted by devout minds as divine acknowledgement. Others swore that the very air vibrated with a resonance that defied physics, a warning or a testament, though none could agree on its meaning. Every observation, however flawed, fed into a growing mythos, that here was not simply a warrior but a force whose actions carried the weight of legend even before the final outcome had been written. The Doomslayer was at once terrifyingly real and almost impossibly intangible, the axis around which rumor, fear, and reverence revolved. By the time he breached the inner sanctums, where the most sacred and secreted of Mechanicus archives were stored, the remaining defenders' will had fractured. They no longer fired indiscriminately. Instead, they hesitated, caught between survival and the recognition that their enemy, if enemy he truly was, moved in a domain beyond comprehension. The Doomslayer's myth had begun to exist independently of his actions. Stories whispered in fear and awe spread like wildfire through Vox channels, transmitted as fragments of reality itself. In those moments, the line between mortal understanding and cosmic speculation blurred. He became the measure against which all consequences would be weighed, a living question whose answer no human or machine could yet claim to know. And yet, even as whispers of apotheosis circulated, he moved forward with singular purpose, unheeding rumor, faith, or fear. His path was not toward recognition, but action. The crucible of battle had expanded from flesh and metal into the realm of belief, and the consequences of his passage were no longer confined to the ship alone. Somewhere beyond, across hive worlds, manufactorums, and orbiting fortresses, the universe was beginning to register his presence not merely as legend, but as a force that might reshape the calculus of war itself. The next phase of reckoning awaited, where the stakes would no longer be survival alone but consequence writ across the stars. The Doomslayer's passage through the Citadel had not been contained. Reports flickered across Vox networks, scrambled and fragmented, of entire regiments falling into disarray, where once they had held line with rigid discipline. On hive worlds below, the citizens whispered of shadows moving faster than light, of warriors whose presence alone bent the rules of survival. Even the Astra Militarum, seasoned in countless campaigns against Xenos and heretic alike, found their calculations useless in anticipating the consequences of a single entity, moving with such inexorable purpose. The battlefield was no longer simply spatial. It had become psychological, spiritual, and systemic, where fear itself carried as much weight as bolter fire or plasma blasts. Orc warbands, previously unrelenting and audacious, began to fracture under the subtle inevitability of his advance. Shouting commanders found their authority undermined by instinctive terror, and their mobs scattered into pockets of chaos, no longer cohesive, no longer coordinated. Skitarii formations faltered in similar fashion, their neural implants overtaxed by a force that seemed to anticipate strategy before it could be calculated. Imperial soldiers, though trained and disciplined, found themselves questioning orders as much as survival, realizing that every encounter was measured not in odds but in a singular, overwhelming certainty. The Doomslayer did not merely fight, he reshaped the very concept of engagement, turning expectation against the participants in a calculus none could dominate. From orbital fortresses and distant manufactorums, fragmented sensors registered anomalies, motion beyond known velocities, impact patterns inconsistent with conventional physics, energy signatures that defied both human and Xenos understanding. Commanders attempted to interpret, to calculate, to assign probability, but the data dissolved into incoherence. Rumors spread like wildfire through the Mechanicus and Imperial ranks alike. Some whispered that fragments of the Emperor's will had observed the pattern of destruction and paused, unsure of intervention. Others posited that this was a force outside both allegiance and morality, a living equation of war that recognized only action, consequence, and momentum. Each interpretation carried weight because all were, in some sense, true. The Doomslayer moved as both event and observer, as judgment and inevitability. The physical scope of conflict expanded as the Doomslayer left the vessel, moving toward orbital platforms and planetary perimeters where the remnants of organized resistance tried, and failed, to marshal defensive positions. Energy cannons roared, missiles tore through the air and bolters spat their deadly hail, yet none of it could slow the relentless approach. Planetside, soldiers glimpsed a figure moving faster than sight, striking before perception could react, leaving devastation in a calculated rhythmic wake. Hive cities burned under the precision of his wrath, manufactorums collapsed in chaotic torrents, and even orbital defense platforms failed to register him before he was already upon them. The tide had shifted. War itself had become subordinate to the momentum of a single unstoppable force. Survivors, both human and alien, began to speak in fragmented reverence, describing the Doomslayer as a force that reshaped not only battle lines but belief. Whispers of apotheosis persisted, interwoven with rationalizations of fear and tactical analysis, until it became impossible to separate legend from fact. His passage through the theater of war had systemic consequences, altering engagements across multiple scales, from squad-level firefights to planetary sieges. Every calculated defense dissolved in the face of a presence that respected neither hierarchy, probability, nor allegiance. And as the Doomslayer pressed forward, the universe seemed to bend, not violently, but inevitably, acknowledging that the tides of war were no longer defined by strategy, numbers, or morality. They were defined by him alone. By the time the smoke and ruin settled across the peripheries of engagement, it was clear that nothing conventional could contain the momentum he carried. Survivors' reports, fragmented and contradictory, spoke of devastation, inevitability, and the sense that the cosmos itself had shifted under the weight of a single will. And as he moved toward the next crucible, toward confrontation with forces that defied even the mechanized and alien intellect, the stage was set not merely for survival or victory, but for a reckoning of cosmic consequence, where the meaning of conflict itself would be tested against the measureless presence of the Doomslayer. By the time the Doomslayer reached the apex of the conflict, the landscape, both physical and psychic, had been utterly transformed. Smoke and fire rose in great plumes across the shattered decks and orbital platforms, mingling with sparks of failing energy grids and the acrid stench of promethium. Skitarii formations lay in ruins, their augmetic limbs fractured and sparking, their command structures annihilated by the sheer precision of his advance. Orc warbands had collapsed into chaotic pockets, bellowing in frustration and fear as their instinctive tactics were rendered irrelevant. Imperial soldiers, even those seasoned in centuries of warfare, trembled as the realization solidified. No conventional force, no strategy, no doctrine could contend with the inevitable force moving among them. The Doomslayer moved like a singularity, every step measured, every strike absolute. Bolt guns spat fire, plasma arcs hissed, yet he navigated through them with the fluidity of kinetic inevitability. Every blow shattered armor, bent metal, and ruptured flesh with mechanical precision, Yet within the motion there was a rhythm almost poetic in its cadence. Sparks arced and hissed across corridors, molten metal pooled like quicksilver at the edges of his path, and the very hull seemed to quiver beneath the weight of his presence. Where he passed, nothing survived unmarked. Where he paused, observers could sense the temporary stillness, the brief calculus of the universe aligning around him. Rumors of apotheosis and divine witness crystallized in fragmented Vox reports. Some whispered that the Emperor's gaze had turned upon him, recognizing not allegiance but the embodiment of judgment and unstoppable force. Others speculated that he operated beyond mortal, xenos, or machine comprehension, a living event whose consequences rippled faster than light or strategy. Yet even as the myths grew, they could not capture the immediacy of presence. The Doomslayer was not legend. He was reality incarnate, a measure against which all else, faith, instinct, morality, and machinery, was tested and found wanting. The survivors' hearts beat in sync with the cadence of his advance, fear and awe entwined in a rhythm as primal as survival itself. The apex of desolation revealed itself most vividly at the central nexus, where manufactorums, command decks, and orbital platforms converged in a labyrinth of steel, energy, and ruin. Here, the Doomslayer became more than warrior. He was law, calculus, and consequence. Orc nobility, mechanized hierarchs, and imperial officers alike faltered. Their perception stretched to the limits of comprehension. Bolter fire ricocheted fruitlessly. Plasma arcs bent and sizzled against his armor, and even the augmented reflexes of Skitarii soldiers failed to register his movements in time. Every motion was deliberate, inevitable, and final, a brutal testament to the force of will manifested in flesh and armor. In the aftermath of each engagement, the survivors bore witness to a theater of devastation that transcended simple carnage. Machinery, flesh, and morale alike were shattered, leaving a tableau of ruin in which the Doomslayer was the singular constant. The platforms groaned under stress. Energy conduits arced and erupted, and fires danced along metal like spectral flames responding to an unseen conductor. Yet amidst this apex of desolation, the Doomslayer's path remained clear, unhesitant, and unbroken. Each strike, each step, each calculated motion was a punctuation mark on a sentence that stretched across the vessel, the orbital platforms, and into rumor and legend among those who survived to witness. As he advanced toward the final threshold, the Doomslayer became simultaneously predator, judge, and myth. Nothing remained to impede him. Yet the true test was not strength, nor strategy, nor firepower. It was consequence writ on a scale that spanned material, psychological, and perhaps even metaphysical planes. The final crucible awaited, where the remnants of resistance, the whispers of the Emperor, and the murmurs of legend would converge. Beyond this apex lay the ultimate reckoning, where the universe itself would measure the momentum and presence of a force that no doctrine, no calculation, and no belief could yet contain. The final threshold opened onto a void both physical and metaphysical, where the remnants of the ship's infrastructure twisted into impossible angles, and the air shimmered with the resonance of destruction and fear. Here the Doomslayer faced not merely enemy forces, but the culmination of consequence itself. Bolt guns spat fire with futile precision. Plasma arcs screamed through the fractured air, and the orc horde, once numerous, now reduced to fractured mobs, clashed against an inevitability that acknowledged neither size nor number. Skitarii formations, meticulously programmed and augmented, faltered in unison, their command networks disrupted by the sheer presence of a force beyond prediction. Every strike, every movement of the Doomslayer became both act and symbol, a declaration that the calculus of judgment was singular and inescapable. Within the central atrium, survivors and observers felt the weight of his passage as something almost tangible, a psychic impression pressed into the marrow of existence. Servitors paused mid-task, cogitator arrays overloaded, and even the most disciplined officers trembled under the implication of what they could not calculate. Whispers of the Emperor's gaze, of fragments of divinity perceived in the pattern of his movements, had reached fever pitch. Some prayed not for victory but for understanding. Others swore oaths to whatever deity might witness, hoping to align themselves, even temporarily, with the inevitability he represented. The Doomslayer neither heard nor acknowledged these efforts. He needed no witness, no affirmation, no allegiance. His judgment was absolute and singular, and it extended beyond the comprehension of all who remained. The apex of his passage revealed itself in both scope and clarity. Every enemy, every obstacle, every shred of resistance became a node in a pattern he moved through, with flawless precision. Orc leaders were torn asunder before the realization of their folly could reach their minds. Skitarii warriors were reduced to smoking husks before their neural implants could compute the threat. Imperial soldiers, their morale shattered yet their awe complete, could only bear witness to the systematic, inexorable destruction of forces far greater in number than themselves. In this final crucible, flesh, machine, and belief alike were subject to the same immutable principle: inevitability. Rumors of apotheosis reached their zenith. Observers, human and alien alike, spoke in fragmented reverence of glimpses of divinity in his armor, of a resonance in his presence that transcended law, creed, and allegiance. Whether real or imagined, these perceptions were inseparable from reality in the minds of those who survived. The Doomslayer had become simultaneously event, judgment, and myth, a being whose actions were catalogued not only as destruction but as narrative, etched into the fabric of witness, survivor, and rumor alike. Every movement reinforced the perception that here was no ordinary warrior. Here was the measure against which consequence itself was weighed. As the last opposition fell, the Doomslayer stood amidst ruin, the silence of absolute inevitability pressing around him. Fires hissed and molten metal cooled, yet the air remained charged with the resonance of his passage. Observers whispered of judgment eternal, of a force that could not be restrained, that existed beyond allegiance, strategy, or comprehension. The ship, the citadel, the planetary surfaces beneath, it all bore the imprint of his momentum, a scar not merely physical but existential. And in the wake of his passage, one immutable truth remained. He was not mortal, not machine, not Xenos, not legend. He was the embodiment of consequence, unstoppable, unbound, and eternal. The universe in all its complexity and chaos had been measured against the Doomslayer, and all had been found wanting.